Hello and welcome to the WPA OG podcast. This episode features part one of an interview with retired Lieutenant General Robert F. Foley, recipient of the Medal of Honor, West Point class of 1963. Retired LTG Foley held numerous command and staff assignments during his 37 years on active duty. In this episode, he talks about his remarkable journey in the Army, invaluable lessons from his career, and dynamic strategies to empower soldiers during combat. Now, please enjoy this interview between retired Lieutenant General Foley, West Point class of 1963, and your host, retired Lieutenant Colonel Dave Seary, 94, Director of the West Point Center for Oral History and instructor in the Department of History.
If you could please tell me a little bit about your background, including where you grew up, what your parents did, and how you became interested in attending West Point.
I was born and raised in a small blue-collar residential community about 20 miles west of Boston. And my mother, my father, and I, and my brother, who was 9 years older than me, lived in the bottom floor of a two-family duplex. And my brother and I had a very small room, bunk beds. I was on the top bunk, he was on the bottom bunk. My father left school, actually, in the 10th grade and was working at a restaurant in Boston. And those days, he left school because he had to make money for the family. And the same situation was with my mother. She dropped out of school in the 9th grade to work as a seamstress. But, I had a very happy childhood. Through elementary school, we were in a beautiful location. It's almost like an area where not only could we enjoy the surrounding area, when we had the Charles River there. So the Charles River was a place where we could boat and swim and in the wintertime play hockey. But we also had an amusement park called Norm Vigor Park. That was great because they had a lot of rides and a lot of people went there and enjoyed themselves. And we were close to the ocean too. So we could go down to Cape Cod and go to other places. So during elementary school and part of my childhood, it was really a lot of fun. I always looked at it and said, it was a true Norman Rockwell experience because it was just a lot of fun, a lot of memories and holidays. It was really terrific. And then 7th and 8th grade came along and left the elementary school. And the junior high school, I was in vocational school. And it was actually a tough neighborhood. I did not like those 2 years at all. And my father, during that time, had purchased a restaurant in Belmont. And in my 9th grade, we moved to Belmont. And that was a major turning point in my life because when I went there, I started taking college prep courses. I got involved in sports. I really enjoyed the people in the town of Belmont, the school teachers, the coaches, all my classmates. Everybody was very supportive. The entire Belmont High School experience was terrific. It was very wholesome, very good. And as I said, I got involved in the college prep academics and sports. And in the spring of my senior year, to talk about going to West Point, in the spring of my senior year, Coach Jack Riley, who was the father of the current Army hockey coach, was in Boston recruiting hockey players. And he picked up the Boston Globe and he noticed an article in there, big splash, that this basketball player from Belmont who scored 44 points and collected 23 rebounds in one game. And this was in the Boston Garden in the state tournament. So he cut the article out and he brought it home to his next door neighbor, who was the Army head basketball coach, George Hunter. And so Coach Hunter called my family, talked to my mother and father, and invited us up to West Point. I told my mother and father, I said, I'm really not interested in going to the military. I've got 15 full scholarship offers. I had plane tickets to go out and visit schools, and good school, North Carolina, Wake Forest, Denver, Oregon, Houston. And I'd already been to visit the Citadel, Providence, Holy Cross, and I really liked Holy Cross. So I said, I'm not quite sure that's for me. But my mother and father had been watching the West Point Story. It's a 30-minute TV series every Friday night at 7:30, and it had young actors like Clint Eastwood and Steve McQueen and others, and they really enjoyed it, and they really wanted to see West Point, and they said, this might be an opportunity for it. Well, we went up to West Point. I walked the grounds. I was so impressed with the history, Fortress West Point. I talked to the cadets. I talked to the basketball players. I got to know Coach Hunter, and I made the decision right then and there that I wanted to go to West Point because I thought it was a very special place. And it turned out I was right. It is a special place. So that's my story.
Yes, sir. And you mentioned hockey as a kid growing up and basketball. Did you play any other sports or did you focus just on those?
Track. I ran the 440, the 880. I did high jumping, but that was really a supplement to build my strength to play basketball. I had a very good basketball coach in high school, and he said, "Hey, you're going to do all these other things in the off season. The one thing I don't want you to do, I don't want you playing any hockey." My brother was a big time hockey player, and so I'd always try to go to Boston Bruins hockey games and that kind of thing. And he found out one day that I was skating at a rink in Belmont, and boy, I got chewed out.
So since we're talking about your West Point time, what is your most vivid memory of our day?
Well, it gets right back to basketball again, because one of the things that Coach Hunter told me when I got to our day, he said, get there early, because the earlier you get there, the more tasks you can accomplish all through the day. And that means you're going to be ahead of the game. And the upper class cadre will look upon you as somebody who's getting things done and who's doing the things right. So it'd be a plus for you. So I did that, and sure enough, by noon, I had most of the things on my tag that, he hung from his belt. And so when I reported to the cadet in the red sash after lunch, he said, well, you got most of the things done right now. Of course, we had the oath ceremony that night. And so he said, you need to just go back to your room, get your gear straightened out. We've gotten all these things from Cadet Supply. And he said, you work on that, and your squad leader will get to you and tell you what else you need to do. Do you have any questions? At that moment in time, I should have said, no, sir. But I didn't, because I really did, going to West Point, I didn't get a full indoctrination. I knew East Barracks wasn't going to be a training program recreational in nature, just by its sound, but I didn't get any other ideas about it. But anyway, it just popped into my mind, and I said, yes, sir. I said, could you tell me how to get to the gym? I want to go shoot a few hoops. Well, the cadre around there heard me say that, and they kept repeating it. Shoot a few hoops, shoot a few hoops. Where do you think you are? And so, needless to say, I didn't go to the gym. I didn't go back to my room, but I got additional instruction in central area. That's my most vivid memory. And what I learned from that was stick with what they told me. No, sir. Yes, sir. No excuse, sir. That's it.
Yes, sir. Now, that's fabulous. And you had a very long and wonderful career in the Army. If you could, give us a synopsis of your best assignments in the Army.
Well, number one best assignment was coming out of cadets. Here we had 4,000 young men and women with strong ideals, great ambition, and all simply just wanted to be all they could be. And a typical day for me was to get all my meetings over with in the daytime. And then in the new meal formation, I walked around and chatted with the cadets. I got out there too early sometimes, just the plebes out there, because they had to be out there, 10 minutes ahead of time. And they didn't say anything. So they gave me the yes or no excuse, sir. And of course, their squad leaders would come afterwards when I talked to a plebe and said, why was the commandant talking to you? So I figured I'd get everybody in trouble. So I stopped doing that, but I enjoyed walking, because you may remember that the cadets talked most they didn't talk much in breakfast, and everybody was dispersed around supper. So it was a good opportunity for me to just wander through the ranks. And when I was a cadet, that never happened. But inevitably, I would get invited to lunch. And there was another 20 or 25 minutes where I could sit with the cadets, listen to what was on their minds, dispel rumors sometimes. Said, well, are we really doing this? I said, no. It allowed me to at least take a snapshot in time that day of what the feeling of the cadets were at that point in time. With 36 companies, I could spread it all over every year. I didn't do that every day, but I tried to do it. It was a great way to keep your hand on the pulse of the Corps of Cadets, is what's happening. And then after lunch, I would go to Corps Squad, to intramurals, to club activities. I did as much as I possibly could to just sit down with cadets and say, how you feeling? What's going on? What do you do? And that kind of thing. And get feedback that way. I always stop by the barbershop, believe it or not, cadets tell their barbers all kinds of stuff. So I get my intelligence update that way. And I get a lot of other things to reach out. For example, beginning of each year, I went to the academic departments, each academic department separately, and talked to them about the policies and programs and goals of the United States Corps of Cadets for that year. Because I wanted them to understand what it was. If they had questions, you know what you buy it. Because there was always this disconnect between the company tactical officers and instructors. And I didn't want that to happen. And so I said, because, we're all in this together. And it was very a fruitful experience because I talked for about 20 minutes. I remember I had this one major in this one department say, sir, I wanted you to know about a uniform deficiency. And I said, and this was the beginning of the year, so they were wearing the short sleeve class shirts. And he said, I see some cadets come over, and I had one in my class the other day, and he had his white undershirt showing underneath the class shirt on his sleeves. So he said, I just wanted to let you know that so the company tax could take that up and make sure it doesn't happen. So I looked at him, I said, what did you say to him? I said, as he said, and I'll never forget it, he said, well, sir, I never said anything because we have to maintain a rapport with all of our cadets because we're teachers. Well, he unwittingly became my primary training aide for exactly the point I was getting across, and that is that all of us, teachers, tax, coaches, clergy, everybody, we're all in the development leaders of character. I said, now let me tell you something. Had you pointed to that cadet and said, you go back to your room right now, get into the proper uniform, and you get back here as fast as you possibly can, let me tell you what you would have done. You would have established all the rapport you need for every single cadet in your class. They would have been fighting to get A's all year long. So I said I think that's one of the best ways to handle it. But anyway, that was some of the reach out things that I did. I talked to the members of the first class each semester, where I always could say, here's 20 minutes of my advice and guidance. And then what do you want to talk about? Let's have it. And sometimes, first time I did it, it started off a little soft. First question I got was from a young man way in the back of the room, first classman. And he said, sir, can you still dunk? So I thought, I missed it. I missed the point. But then as the discussions came on, they got more serious and we were able to really come to some understandings of kinds of things that I was looking for in terms of their leadership of the Corps of Cadets. And I want to make sure that it was very clear. Another thing I did was at the end of each session with these cows, yearlings, and plebes, I said, do you have any questions or anything at all? Send me an email. Any suggestions or issues or concerns? He said, and I said, I guarantee you'll always get an answer. And they did. Many times the answer was very short, like, no. Because I remember one cadet emailed me and he said, 5 cadets who want to go down to the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. and climb to the top and throw it or beat Navy battle. I said, no. So I think by having this email communication back and forth, it was extremely helpful. So that was just some ideas of why being a commandant of cadets was the most rewarding and enjoyable experience I had by 37 years on active duty, because I could help to shape the lives of these young men and women.
If you want to talk about any of your other assignments, I'd love to hear about some of the other key assignments that you had.
I'd say the other one that was really good, it took second place of all the ones that I had. I'm not going to put Pentagon assignments in any of them, even though I feel that it's a wonderful thing to come back to the Pentagon because you kind of keep the troops straight about things that you know in the field and you can pass that on at the highest levels. But I thought that my assignment as a battalion commander of a mechanized infantry battalion in Germany would have come in second place in terms of, it was another very enjoyable one. It was made most enjoyable and most significant simply because I had some outstanding officers and NCOs. Every one of my company commanders were terrific. Their wives were terrific. The primary staff were outstanding. The magnificent group of non-commissioned officers, starting with the sergeant major. And when you've got good people like that, you've got top personnel, we were able to accomplish every mission in a first-class manner because they knew what they were doing. They were seasoned. They were excited about things. They were good leaders. And we got a lot of things done. And the other thing was that I never realized how much and how important the spouses were. We went to the field, the spouses would be out there working on family activities and taking care of issues that come up in the families. They would be involved in creating social events. So in addition to accomplishing our mission all the time, we were having fun. We were enjoying it. It was an enjoyable 2 years that I commanded that battalion. And it got to be the point where we had officers and NCOs that were coming to our battalion to see me or the sergeant major and ask if we'd hire them. Can we be assigned to your battalion because we like what you're doing? The lesson I learned from that, Dave, and I think it's an important one, is that you really have to intensely manage your key personnel in your organization. And I had an organization chart, which was in the corner of my office. And every day I looked at it, and the organization chart had the top, battalion commander, sergeant major, company commanders and first sergeants underneath that, platoon leaders and platoon sergeants. Those are the only ones I managed. When I was looking at each one as to when they were going to leave, who's going to replace them, whether or not that person was qualified, and maybe they'd be qualified someplace else. I talked with company commanders about it. I get their input. But that made sure that as the organization evolved with new people, kept the best in line. If I put somebody in there and they weren't cutting it, it didn't take me long to take them right back out. I always give people an opportunity to show how well they can do in a position, but you reach a point where they're no longer being good for your soldiers. So you need to pull them out. That intensive management, I think, was great. And I used that from then on and made sure that I was getting all the right people in the right position, because it's not just about one person that it's a team out there. We're all going to work together to get the best things done. So those are the two assignments that come to me right away. Really felt that at the end of the day, did an awful lot, not only in terms of getting the unit mission accomplished, but in leading development so that all the officers and NCOs can go on to bigger and better things.
So far in the interview, you've talked about several key leadership positions that you had, and also some of the lessons you learned or the ways you implemented good leadership. So can you tell us a little bit more about some important leadership lessons that you learned throughout your career?
Let me talk with what I think is the most important leadership lesson learned. And that is the importance of listening. I found that my 37 years on active duty that we leaders just don't spend enough time on the issue of listening. So I concluded that leaders at all levels, squad leaders, battalion commanders, corporate CEOs, need to carve out time daily if they can, just to listen. And I don't mean to a 1-hour PowerPoint briefing in their office. I mean getting out of their office, going to the motor pool, training area, the dining facility, the workspace where the officers and the NCOs and the soldiers are working, and turn off the transfer and go into the receipt mode and just listen and ask questions and find out things. I'll give you an example. When I was the commanding general of the U.S. Army Military District of Washington, D.C., the old guard came under my organization, and one of the first units that I wanted to go see right after I took command was the caisson platoon, because that's a very important part of what happens at Arlington National Cemetery when you have deceased military personnel. So I said, they're very key and very critical. I want to go out and see them, how it works. And so I went there and visited. Boy, I was so impressed. I was impressed with the cleanliness of the stables, with the NCOs that I met, soldiers how they were taking care of those horses. And as I walked around the different stalls, you could see the horses' heads come out, you could pat the horses. I really enjoying it. And I got to this one stall, and the horse didn't have his head sticking out, even though here the group of people coming by, because it'd be treats for them. And we had several NCOs follow me around. But the horse was in the stall, but he was backed up against the rear of the stall. So I looked at the NCO and I said, "What's wrong with him?" He said, "Well, sir, he doesn't want to go to work." And I said, "Well, what do you mean he doesn't want to go to work? Why?" He said, "Well, sir, you see on his back, he was a sort of a gray colored horse, and he had these black lesions on his back." He said, "Those sores he gets from the harness he put around him when he pulls the case on." I said, "Okay, what's being done for him?" He said, "Well, we have salve that we can put on those lesions, but he's got to continue to pull the case on because we have to keep up with field work." And I said, "No wonder it hurts him." I said, "No, he doesn't. have to continue to do that. And no, he won't. Today, you're going to send this horse out to Fort Belvoir. We had a 10-acre farm out at Fort Belvoir where we placed horses that were sick or lame, whether we had new horses that were coming in that needed to be trained. And I said, this horse isn't going to come back until the veterinary clears him completely for duty. And I said, if you have any other horses like this, they're going out there too. So then I said, well, how many horses do you have? He said, 35. I said, how many do you need? Silence fell over the stables at Fort Mine. And I said, no, wait, this is a pretty fundamental question. How many horses do you need? They didn't know. I said, okay, 1 week, I want to get the regimental commander and his staff, company commander, and everybody else here. And I want you to tell them how many horses you need. And I want you to break it down by type. Shire, Percheron, quarter horse, Mustang. From acquisition to retirement, I want you to lay out the complete process. I want a total case on platoon analysis. So next week they came back and I said, okay, how many horses do you need? He said, 65. Well, that's a far cry from 35. I said, 65. 30 more horses. I said, all right, I'm going to give you 90 days to get the horses, get them trained, and get them into this rotation so we don't have this problem again. And so, I can't make this up, but one of the NCOs said, sir, when are we going to get them? Now, as I told you, I'm an Irish kid from Boston. And I didn't see many horses in my life, but I said, look, the last time I checked, Wyoming, Arizona, Montana, Colorado, Texas, they're running all over the place. But anyway, regimental commander put a team together and they sent it down the Southwest and they went to visit the rodeos and ranch owners. And what was very interesting, really terrific. Many of the ranch owners, when they found out that their steeds were going to be used to carry the remains of deceased veterans to their final resting place in Arlington National Cemetery, they donated the horses and they transported them all the way to Washington, D.C. for nothing. Now, I did all that and changed all that system simply because I got out of my office and I went down there and I was willing to listen, ask a few questions. So that's why it's an example of why it is important, just like I was doing with the cadets in the noon meal formation. Get out there and listen. You find out things that you probably should have known. You're never going to find out unless you go out there and make a point. And when I said carve out time, in other words, whatever's on your schedule, you stop, carve out the time and go out there and listen. So that was the major thing that I got from leadership lessons.
Yes, sir. Now, at West Point, the motto is duty, honor, country. And the 7 Army values are loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. How important is it to embrace these institutional values when leading soldiers in peacetime or in combat?
Well, Dave, it's essential. And we're very fortunate in the United States Army because we have what I like to call the officer NCO team, starting with platoon leader, platoon sergeant, company commander, first sergeant, battalion commander, sergeant major, all the way up to chief of staff of the Army and sergeant major of the Army. You've got this officer NCO team. And they're the moral conscience of their organization. And they have the moral obligation to ensure that the right values are instilled in their soldiers individually, as well as in the culture of the organization collectively. I think that's a very important thing to understand because, when soldiers come to a danger area, combat, or if they have to make a decision when they're in peacetime, if they're instilled with those values way ahead of time, you're ahead of time because many soldiers are on point many different ways. And so that's why I felt about it. And every command I ever had, I said, don't just be able to say loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and courage. Talk about each one. What does it mean? What's precisely do you want your soldiers to understand? I just take loyalty, for example. I know many leaders, in fact, many of them are very emphatic about this. They say, well, loyalty is easy. Whatever my boss wants, I give them 100%. I'm going to salute, move out, and they get exactly, I want to make sure I'm loyal to their desires and what they want done. When I would hear that, in fact, I heard it recently from a senior non-commissioned officer. So it's not something that was in the old days. And I just happened to be down at Fort Jackson training center. And I said, that's the way we do it. That's why loyalty is so important. I said, well, I would argue that the leader who also has the moral courage to go to his boss and say, I don't think what you're doing is right. I don't think it's the correct course of action. I think that here's the reasons why I don't think it should be done. I think that leader is also very loyal. May not be loyal to look at his boss. His boss might not think it loyal. But what about those institutional values? Where do they come in? My view is if you're loyal to those institutional values, 95% of the time, you're going to be right. It's the right thing to do. I'll tell you what, I'll just go ahead and give you an example of what I mean. When I was a brigade commander in Germany, I had a tank brigade, 2 Abrams main battle tanks and 1 Bradley fighting vehicle. It was the most modern armored brigade in Europe. Nobody else had the Bradleys. Few of them had the Abrams main battle tanks. And we were getting ready to go out and reforge it. You remember reforging, we don't do it anymore. But it was an opportunity for brigade-sized units to get out in the countryside in the fall of each year when the farmers had their crops in, and you could maneuver all over, and you could practice what you needed for the war plans against the Warsaw Pact formations. And so it was a very important time to do that. Anyway, I was given a warning order, I'd say a couple of weeks before reforging was to commence from the division staff, and they said, you may have to conduct a river crossing exercise using the Bradley fighting vehicles. And so you might want to get ready for that. Well, I was all ready for it. We had been training to do that. Bradley fighting vehicles at that time had an amphibious capability. They don't now. Been up armored, and there's no way that you can put them in the water. But they did then. It was something with all the rivers in Germany that the designers felt it would be a good thing. Finally, by chance, 2 days before the exercise was to start, I was out there in the terrain, and I found these engineers preparing a river site for the Bradleys to cross. And nobody coordinated with me. Nobody had said anything about it. I'm the primary guy. I'm the only one with Bradleys. So anyway, as I went and looked at the river site, first of all, the current was way too fast. Bradleys aren't speedboats. They get in the water and they can only go a certain speed. The current's going to kick them back. This is slopes on the river, on the egress and ingress points were way too steep. The soil on the side of the river was very soft and sandy. It was just unacceptable. So I was talking to some of my fellow brigade commanders about all that. Well, that night, division commander, and it's all in this warehouse out in the area, in the German countryside. And he had brigade commanders, battalion commanders, division staff, a whole host of people, probably about 50 officers and NCOs in there. And I was sitting up in the front row with the other brigade commanders, and he walked in, and first thing he said was, I understand that there may be some commanders that are reluctant to swim the Bradleys across the river to start the exercise. And by the way, it was the Donau River, but it was not a swimming across the whole river. It was a tributary that we used them for a training exercise. So it wasn't that big. But he said, but this is a combat capability that we need to use, so we will be swimming the Bradleys across the river to start the exercise. Well, I immediately stood up. I was probably 5 feet away from him, and I said, sir, I highly recommend that you do not try to swim Bradleys across the river. That sight is unacceptable. The river is too fast. The slope of the river banks is too steep. The soil will catch those treads and hook it, and we don't want one to turn over. Anyway, the way those conditions are there, they're not conditions where Bradleys can swim safely. And if we try it, I think we're going to place our soldiers in extreme danger. Well, when I said that, number one, he was surprised that I said it to him up. I could tell by the expression on his face. He was really surprised. Secondly, he was not happy about it. And he had never talked to me about it. I mean, here I am, his immediate subordinate commander. He never even talked to me about the exercise at all. And maybe he thought his division staff was doing it. So he turned to his chief of staff and he said, I want Colonel Foley to brief the corps commander tomorrow morning or why the Bradleys can't cross the river. So I said, well, this is good. So the next morning I asked the corps commander to come, and I went right to the river site where the engineers were preparing the crossing, the egress and ingress points. And I put a butcher board out there with charts on it so that I could give him a good explanation of the exercise. And I went through exactly what the Bradley fighting vehicle has to do, how it gets across the river, what it uses for momentum. But I told him that this site was unacceptable because it just, Bradley fighting vehicle would not be able to maneuver in it, would not be able to get up the banks of the river. And while I was giving him this briefing, he was watching these twin diesel engine engineer boats struggling against the current as they were going back and forth across this tributary. So anyway, when I finished, he turned to the assembled group and he said, "Okay, I think one of the things we need to understand is you always want to heed the lessons from combat and from World War II. The lessons of history are very important. One of the lessons we have learned in the World War II was to trust the judgment of commander on the ground." He said, "We will not swim the Bradleys across the river. Instead, we will conduct an administrative crossing using the bridges. We'll cross all the forces on the other side and we'll start the exercise from the other side." Well, there was no question that was the right decision. Now, I would also say one thing: when you do something like that, when you confront your boss I felt that people can say, "Well, what you should have done was talk to him afterwards." I didn't want to talk to him afterwards. I want to make sure that everybody understood exactly how I felt about it. So anyway, my only caveat with all of that is when you do that, there may be consequences. And there were for me. I read about it in my officer efficiency report. It wasn't pretty. But you know what? I wouldn't have done a thing different because my motivation was not, ensuring that I pleased my boss. That was not the loyalty I was looking at. My loyalty was to what was the right thing to do. What about my soldiers? What am I going to tell my soldiers? If I don't think it's them crossing that river at that point in time, it's the right thing to do, I'm not going to tell them to do it. So anyway, I think those are things that all officers and NCOs ought to be well-grounded in institutional values. And that's why I think that all of ethics and values classes that we get are extremely important for officer and NCO education.
Sure. And I think one of the important things about the story you just told is the strength of your conviction in that, it would have been an unsafe act and wouldn't have been good for anything at all, the soldiers, the equipment, anything. And so I think that the strength of your conviction also is spoken to in that story.
Yeah. Every bit of training you do with soldiers, you're risking some things happening in terms of safety, but I always was on the side of safety. Unless you're in combat, you have to, but you don't ever unnecessarily risk your soldiers' lives.
Yes, sir. But, and you spoke about combat there. You were a rifle company commander during the war in Vietnam. What did you do to inspire your soldiers to face the enemy, overcome fear, and survive the rigors of combat?
Just about every day as a rifle company commander, I'd be asking myself, what is it makes these soldiers do what they have to do on the battle? And because there were some dangerous missions, just the combat assault alone was a tough mission. Every combat assault we went in, before we landed, I had both of my feet out on the skids. I had my hand around the center pole. I was looking at the LZ because I want to make sure it was going to be secure before we popped everybody in there. And so, there is dangers as you're going in just in a combat assault. Stay behind ambush was the same thing. Many times we went out with the whole company and left the platoon back at night. And when came in and picked them up, Viet Cong would think we're all gone. No, but that's a risky proposition, but they're out there with all their equipment. And it's a tough thing. The other thing was what we called tunnel rats. Whenever we came across a spider hole and we suspected there might be ammunition or supplies or something down there, we called for tunnel rats. I never had to ask for a volunteer for tunnel rats. My soldiers come running up, stripping off their web gear and say, "Sir, I got this one." They went down inside that tunnel with no steel pot, no web gear on, just a 45 caliber pistol and a flashlight, not knowing whether it was booby trap, not knowing whether it was PC going to be down in there with rifle, because some of those, as you went down into one hole, would open up into a big cavernous opening where they had supplies and weapons and ammunition and medical supplies and people and bunks. Anyway, intuitively, we know that leadership and discipline and training are all factors to ensure that you overcome fear. But I found the most compelling motivation was this intense regard which soldiers had for their fellow soldiers. These were their buddies, their friends, their comrades. They'd been with them 24 hours a day. They would do anything to prevent their buddies from being killed or wounded. And it was kind of an unwritten creed. A soldier would say, I'm never going to let my buddy down. And so, I leveraged that. I said, that's an important thing. So this intense regard, this consideration and caring about your buddies was extremely important. And what happens is your soldier is going into combat and he's so worried about his buddies that he's not worried about himself. And so that's the way he overcomes fear. And the same thing happened with me. I was so worried about 120, 130 soldiers that I had out there, what they're doing. I wasn't worried about me. I just had to make sure I was taking care of them. And so that's kind of how I looked at how we overcome.
Yes, sir. And sir, this is probably a good place to mention that you were in the Medal of Honor during your tour in Vietnam for actions such as what you've just described, correct, sir?
Yeah, it's a long story, but I'll try to get to it. It was 5 November 1966, and I was the commander of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry. I had a sister company that was behind enemy lines. I was given a mission at 1 o'clock in the morning from battalion commander that I was assigned to, which was not my normal battalion commander. My normal battalion commander had been killed that day, and the company commander of the company that was behind enemy lines was killed. So it was a tough situation. And we knew they had killed and wounded, but they were behind enemy lines. And the battalion commander they reported to, who was the Major Foley was his name. He was the battalion commander, 1st Battalion, 27th. I was in 2nd Battalion. But I was attached to him for this operation. And he said, I'm convinced that if we don't get to Charlie Company behind enemy lines, they're going to be annihilated in the morning. They're surrounded by BC, and we were up against, at that point in time, we were up against a significant North Vietnamese army population, but a battalion from the 101st Regiment. And so he said, you have got to cross the line of departure, pass through friendly lines, and bust through the enemy defense systems, link up with Charlie Company, and form a corridor back through the enemy lines and come back through friendly lines with Charlie Company's dead and wounded. And I looked at him and I sat there thinking about it. I think, boy, this is a suicide mission. But I said, but who else is going to do it? These guys are going to be out there and going to be annihilated. Somebody's got to do it. So I got my platoon leaders together and briefed them on everything but bringing the Charlie Company back through enemy lines, because I felt if we were lucky enough to bust through the enemy defenses and link up with Charlie Company, I wasn't about to come back through enemy lines carrying dead and wounded. I'd picked a place on the map that was northwest, and I'd said, we're going to move out there. So as it turned out, I assaulted at 7:30 the next morning, and we immediately hit with machine guns and hand grenades and snipers in trees. We were not making very good progress. I was very concerned. I didn't want to lose momentum, because once soldiers go down or they stop, you lose momentum. And we never did. We continued to push right up until we got to the enemy bunker and trench system. And we assaulted with all 3 platoons on line. And we fired M16s, M60 machine guns, threw hand grenades, used light anti-tank weapons. And it was the entire company that was firing at the enemy trench system. And they withdrew. When they withdrew, I sat back and I said, we've been in this battle for 3.5 hours. I've suffered heavy casualties. We're low on ammunition. I can't go any further. About that time, I got a call from Major Lawford, who was the battalion S3 and also the acting battalion commander, because my battalion commander was killed that day. And he said, you need to conduct an orderly withdrawal, because your assault on the enemy defenses had them uncover Charlie Company. And when they uncovered Charlie Company, 3 companies that were attached to 196th Light Infantry Brigade and 1st Battalion, 27th Infantry, put together an ad hoc battalion. They swept in from the north, linked up with Charlie Company, evacuated them basically the same way I was going to go, out to that portion northwest of the battle area. He said, so you just need to make an orderly withdrawal. And so that's what we did. Unfortunately, we had 13 killed and 31 wounded as a result of that attack. But I would just tell you that I referred to them once in this book that I wrote, that every one of those soldiers never hesitated. They never took one step back. very dedicated, determined fashion. They went forward because they knew they had a job to do. And I was very proud of every single one of them. And I think that indomitable spirit that they had that day simply made the difference in getting the job done. So that's what happened for me to be recommended for the Medal of Honor. And when I left Vietnam, which was several months later, I had no idea that recommendation was going forward. So this was November of 66. I didn't find out about it until April of 1968, when one of my West Point classmates, Jay Westermeyer, who was working at the Pentagon at the time, and I was teaching at Fort Belvoir, he came to see me and he said, the President of the United States is going to present you the Medal of Honor on 1 May 1968. I mean, I was stunned. I had gotten a Silver Star on the 6th from General G.G. O'Connor, who was the acting division commander of the 25th Infantry Division. I thought that was it. But after I left, they put in this recommendation and went all the way through, but I never knew a thing about it. Anyway, that was another part of an exciting story. The only thing about going to the White House and getting the Medal of Honor is I almost thought I'd rather be out there getting shot at. Being in the White House of the United States is a very intimidating process.
This has been a production of the WPAOG Broadcast Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show and join us each week for a new episode. Thank you for listening.